The 5 pennies lay on the worn countertop of Miller's Mercantile, a dull copper constellation against the dark wood, and they were not enough. My Lin knew this before she'd even placed them there, her fingers tracing the worn profiles of forgotten leaders. The scent of flour dust and cured bacon hung thick in the summer air of Redemption Gulch, a town that had offered her little of its namesake. The loaf of bread she wanted, small and dense, sat on a shelf behind Mr. Miller. It cost 7 cents. A fortune she did not possess. She wore a cheongsam, the traditional dress of her homeland, but its once vibrant silk had faded to the color of a dusty road. The fabric was thin at the elbows and the high collar, once a sign of modesty and grace, was frayed. She kept her eyes downcast, focused on the 5 coins, as if her concentration alone could will 2 more into existence. She could feel Mr. Miller's stare, a heavy, impatient weight. He was a man whose generosity was as thin as a worn-out dime. "That's all you got, then?" he asked, his voice flat. He didn't need an answer. He was just filling the silence that her poverty created. Before she could gather her coins and her dignity to leave, the floorboards creaked behind her. A pair of scuffed leather boots stopped a few feet away. The man they belonged to smelled of horse, sun-baked dust, and something clean, like pine sap. Jedediah Stone had been in town for 3 days, long enough to learn its rhythms. He'd seen the woman before, a silent figure moving along the edges of the boardwalk, always alone. He'd seen the way other townsfolk looked through her, as if she were a ghost haunting the daylight. Now, seeing the 5 pennies and the rigid set of her shoulders, he understood a part of her story he hadn't before. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over the counter. "I'll be needing a sack of flour, Mr. Miller. And some coffee. And add that loaf of bread to my bill," he gestured with a slight nod toward the shelf. Mr. Miller's gaze flickered from Jedediah to My Lin and back again. A slow, knowing smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "Whatever you say, friend. Your money's good here." The implication hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Jedediah ignored it. He looked at the woman, truly looked at her for the first time. Her face was fine-boned, her skin smooth despite the hardships that had surely etched lines around her eyes. Those eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on him now, wide with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. She had not asked for charity. She did not want it. He tipped his hat slightly. He said, his voice a low rumble. "It's too hot a day to be worrying over bread." My Lin said nothing. Her hand, small and delicate, swept the 5 pennies from the counter and closed them in her fist. When Mr. Miller wrapped the loaf in brown paper and set it beside her, she did not reach for it. Jedediah picked it up and held it out to her. The paper was warm. For a long moment, she just stared at the offering. Accepting it was a surrender. Refusing it was starvation. Her pride was a fierce, cold thing, but hunger was a fire in her belly. With a barely perceptible nod, she took the bread, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was as light as a moth's wing. She turned and walked out of the store without a word, her back straight, the tattered grey dress a stark contrast to the bright, unforgiving sunlight outside. Jedediah watched her go, a strange ache settling in his chest. He paid for his supplies, his movement slow and deliberate. As Mr. Miller counted out the change, he leaned in. "That woman," Miller said, his voice conspiratorial, "lives in that little shack down by the dry creek bed. Husband was one of them railroad workers. A cave-in last year. She ain't got nobody." Jedediah just nodded, his face unreadable. He gathered his flour and coffee, the weight of them a familiar comfort. But as he stepped back out onto the boardwalk, the heat of the day felt different. The town of Redemption Gulch, which had seemed like just another dusty stop on his long drift, now had a problem. And Jedediah Stone, for reasons he couldn't quite name, was beginning to feel like that problem was his to solve. What he didn't realize was that the loaf of bread was only the beginning, and that the town's silent judgment was a far more dangerous obstacle than a 2-cent debt. His act of kindness did not go unnoticed, nor was it well received. By evening, the story had been passed from the mercantile to the saloon and back again. A drifter, a man with no stake in the town, had paid for the Chinese widow's bread. In a place like Redemption Gulch, where community was defined as much by who was excluded as who was included, this was an anomaly. It was a disruption. The next morning, Jedediah was checking the shoes on his horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, when a man approached him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. His name was Roy Barlow, and he owned the livery, the saloon, and held the deed to half the businesses on Main Street. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who never had to ask for anything twice. "Mr. Stone," Barlow said. His voice was smooth, but it had an edge like a new knife. "I hear you've taken an interest in our town's affairs." Jedediah didn't stop his work. He ran a hand down Dust's leg, feeling for heat. "Just buying supplies, Mr. Barlow." "Didn't realize that counted as an affair." "It does when it involves certain people," Barlow said, stepping closer. "That woman you helped yesterday. She keeps to herself. We like it that way. It's cleaner." Jedediah finally straightened up and looked Barlow in the eye. He was a good head shorter than the other man, but there was a stillness in him that gave him his own kind of weight. "She looked hungry," he said simply. "Maybe she was," Barlow conceded with a shrug. "That's her business. Not yours. Not ours. You're just passing through. Don't go stirring a pot that's settled." He smiled, but it was a cold, flat thing. Some things are best left alone. The warning was clear. It was a piece of friendly advice that wasn't friendly at all. It was a map of the town's boundaries, and my Lynn was on the wrong side of them. Jedediah gave a slow nod. "I appreciate the lay of the land, Mr. Barlow." But the conversation had the opposite of its intended effect. Barlow's veiled threat settled in Jedediah's mind like a burr under a saddle blanket. He'd been content to drift, to move from one place to the next without putting down roots. It was safer that way. But the image of my Lynn's face, the quiet defiance in her eyes, wouldn't leave him. He thought of her in that shack by the dry creek, alone, with nothing but a single loaf of bread he'd forced on her. Later that day, he took the sack of flour and the coffee and walked toward the edge of town. The shack was even smaller and more dilapidated than he'd imagined. The wood was sun-bleached and splintered, and the roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. There was no glass in the single window, just a piece of burlap tacked over the opening. Yet, beside the crooked porch step, was a small, tidy patch of dirt where a few stubborn bin plants were fighting their way toward the sun. He hesitated on the path, feeling like an intruder. This was her home, her private space. He had no right to be there. But as he was about to turn back, the burlap flap was pushed aside and she stepped out. She was holding a wooden bucket, and she stopped dead when she saw him. Her hair was tied back, and without the dim light of the mercantile, he could see the exhaustion etched onto her face. She looked at the sacks in his hands, and her expression hardened. "I do not need this," she said. Her voice was quiet, but firm. Her English was precise, accented but clear. "It's just flour and coffee," he said, setting them down on the porch. "It'll go to waste if I don't use it, and I'm not much of a cook." It was a clumsy lie, and they both knew it. She didn't move. She stood by the door, her arms crossed, the empty bucket still in her hand. She was a fortress, and he was laying siege with groceries. "Why?" she asked, the single word cutting through the afternoon heat. Jedediah shifted his weight. He wasn't a man who was good with words. He was better with horses, with the silent language of the trail. "Because Barlow told me not to," he said, the truth coming out before he could stop it. "And I don't much like being told what to do." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe, crossed her face. Her posture softened, just a fraction. She looked from his face to the sacks of food, and then back again. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the buzz of insects in the dry grass. She was weighing him, measuring his intentions against the years of mistrust she had learned to carry. Finally, she gave a small, stiff nod. "The coffee will be bitter without sugar," she stated, not as a complaint, but as a fact. A slow smile spread across Jedediah's face. "I'll remember that for next time," he said. He turned and walked away, leaving the supplies on her porch. He didn't look back, but he could feel her eyes on him the entire way. He had crossed a line. He had stepped out of the role of a passing drifter and into something else, something more complicated. He had challenged Roy Barlow and the silent, unwritten laws of Redemption Gulch. The flour and coffee on her porch were more than just a gift. They were a declaration. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was a fight that was far from over. He did not yet know that the secret to winning it lay not in his strength, but in a history she kept locked away, as silent and guarded as her heart. A week passed. Jedediah saw My Lynn in town once, from a distance. She was walking with her gaze fixed on the ground, and she did not look his way. He made no move to approach her. He had made his gesture, and the next move, if there was to be one, was hers. In the meantime, he felt the town's chill. Men in the saloon would stop talking when he entered. Mr. Miller served him with a clipped, grudging efficiency. Barlow watched him from the porch of his office, his expression unreadable. Jedediah was an outsider who had meddled, and the town was waiting to see if he would have the good sense to move on. He was thinking of doing just that when, one evening, as he was returning to the livery, he found something waiting for him. Tucked into the strap of his saddle was a small, intricately folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single, perfectly dried bin blossom, pale and delicate. There were no words. None were needed. It was an acknowledgement. A thank you. It was, in its own quiet way, a conversation. The next day, he bought a small bag of sugar and a slab of bacon. This time, when he walked to the shack by the creek, he didn't hesitate. He knocked on the door frame. She opened the door, and for the first time, he saw the inside of her home. It was tiny, just one room, but it was impeccably clean. A simple cot was in one corner, a small table and a single chair in the other. His sack of flour was neatly tucked away, and the smell of coffee lingered faintly in the air. I remembered the sugar, he said, holding up the bag. She looked at him, then at the bag, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, softening the hard lines of grief and worry. You are a stubborn man, Jedediah Stone. He was surprised she knew his name, then remembered how fast news traveled in a town this small. I've been called worse. She stepped back, a silent invitation. He entered, feeling large and clumsy in the small space. He set the sugar and bacon on the table. The room was sparse, almost empty of personal belongings, except for one thing. On a small shelf above her cot sat a small, dark wooden box, closed and unadorned. Please, she said, gesturing to the chair. Sit. He sat, and she poured him a cup of coffee in a tin mug. It was strong and black. She did not take one for herself but stood by the window, looking out at the dusty yard. My husband, she began, her voice soft. His name was Way. He was a good man. Strong. He believed the promises they made. A new life, he said. A country of gold. She turned to face him, her eyes dark with memory. He worked on the railroad, blasting tunnels through the mountains. It was dangerous work. The foreman did not care for the lives of my people. They were cheaper than the dynamite. She paused, her hand going to the high collar of her dress. There was a collapse. A section of tunnel. They told me he was gone. They gave me $20 and told me to leave the camp. This shack, it was abandoned. I came here. I'm sorry, Jedediah said. The words felt small and useless. Sorrow does not buy bread, she said, her voice devoid of self-pity. Way was promised more. He signed a contract. There was pay owed. A settlement for his death. Mr. Barlow was the agent for the railroad company in this territory. When I asked him, he showed me a paper with my husband's mark on it, a mark saying he had been paid in full before the accident. He said my husband must have spent it, or lost it. He said the matter was closed. Jedediah sat forward. You think the paper was a lie? I know it was, she said with quiet certainty. Wei could not write his name in your language. But he could write it in ours. And he was a careful man. He would have sent the money to me. He always did. She gestured toward the wooden box on the shelf. He sent me letters. I cannot read them. They are in our tongue. But I know his hand. The mark on Mr. Barlow's paper was not his. Here was the truth of it. This wasn't just about prejudice and poverty. It was about theft. Barlow hadn't just been enforcing the town's social order, he was protecting his own crime. He had likely forged the document and pocketed the settlement money himself, leaving a widow with nothing, assuming she was powerless to challenge him. A cold anger settled in Jedediah's gut. Those letters, he said, looking at the box. They might be proof. They are just words I cannot understand, she said, a wave of weariness washing over her. There is no one here who can read them. The weight of her isolation hit him then. She was a stranger in a strange land, not just culturally, but linguistically. She was holding the key to her own salvation, but she couldn't turn it in the lock. As if on cue, a shadow fell across the open doorway. Roy Barlow stood there, his bulk filling the frame. He had a piece of paper in his hand. His polite smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold ownership. "My Lynn," he said, his voice hard. "We've had a complaint. Squatting on unclaimed property. This is a notice of eviction. You have 3 days to vacate." He didn't look at Jedediah, but the message was for him. He was showing him the true nature of his power. My Lynn's face went pale, but she stood her ground, her chin held high. "This was my husband's home." "Your husband is dead," Barlow said flatly. "And his contract is settled. The railroad company owns this land now, and they've sold it to me. It's all legal and tidy." He tossed the paper onto the floor. 3 days. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. The eviction notice lay on the floor between them, a declaration of war. Jedediah looked from the paper to the small wooden box on the shelf. The fight wasn't just about a loaf of bread or a bag of sugar anymore. It was about a man's legacy and a woman's right to exist. Jedediah stood up. He had planned to be a drifter, to keep moving. But now, he had a reason to stay. He had to find someone who could read those letters. 3 days. The deadline hung over them like a hawk circling its prey. Jedediah knew Barlow would be true to his word. He would arrive with the town marshal, a man firmly in his pocket, and forcibly remove My Lynn and her few possessions from the shack. The town would watch, and their silence would be its own form of approval. "The telegraph," Jedediah said, his mind racing. "There's a station in Carson City. It's a 2-day ride, hard going. There are Chinese workers there, men who work the silver mines, men who run businesses. Someone there can read these." My Lynn looked at the wooden box, then back at him. A fragile hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in over a year, flickered in her eyes. "You would do this." "I told you," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "I don't like being told what to do." She went to the shelf and took down the box. She opened it and handed him a small stack of thin, brittle papers covered in elegant, complex characters. The paper was soft from handling, the ink faded in places. He took them, his rough, calloused fingers gentle as he held what felt like the last pieces of a man's life. He tucked them securely inside his shirt. "Barlow will be watching," she warned. "He will know you have left." "Let him," Jedediah said. "It'll keep him busy while I'm gone." He saddled dust in the pre-dawn light, the town still sleeping around him. He rode out not south toward the main trail, but north, into the Rocky Hills, making it look like he was heading for the prospecting camps. Once out of sight of the town, he circled back, pushing his horse hard toward the west and Carson City. The ride was grueling. The summer sun beat down, and the alkali flats shimmered with heat. He rode through the night, guided by the stars, stopping only to let Dust drink from his canteen. He thought of My Lynn, alone in that shack, waiting. He thought of her quiet strength, the fierce pride that had nearly made her refuse a simple loaf of bread. He was no hero, no knight in shining armor. He was just a man who had seen an injustice and found he could not turn his back on it. He arrived in Carson City on the evening of the second day, covered in dust and bone-weary. The city was a bustling hub of commerce and chaos. He found the Chinese Quarter, a vibrant neighborhood of laundries, eateries, and small shops. He walked into a small apothecary, the air thick with the scent of herbs and spices. An old man with a long, thin beard and kind eyes looked up from behind the counter. Jedediah laid the letters on the counter. "Sir," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need your help. I need to know what these say. It's for a friend. A widow." The old man, Mr. Chen, picked up a letter, his fingers tracing the characters. He read silently for a long time, his brow furrowed. He picked up another, and then a third. Finally, he looked up at Jedediah, his expression grave. "This is not just a letter from a husband to his wife," he said slowly. "This is a record. Your friend's husband, Wei, he was an educated man. He kept a journal. He lists names, dates, and amounts. He writes that the foreman, a man named Barlow, was skimming wages from all the workers on his crew. He was forcing them to sign papers they could not read, claiming they were supply receipts, but they were acknowledgments of pay they never received." Mr. Chen pointed to a specific passage in the last letter. "Here, he says he confronted Barlow. He says Barlow threatened him. He writes, 'If anything happens to me, the truth is in this box.' He was afraid. He knew Barlow was a dangerous man. It was all there. It wasn't just theft, it was a systematic pattern of fraud, and Wei had been the one brave enough to document it. His death in the cave-in suddenly seemed far more sinister than a simple accident." "Can you write this down for me?" Jedediah asked. "In English? A translation?" Mr. Chen nodded. "It will take some time. But yes. For this woman, I will do it." Jedediah spent the night in Carson City, his mind a whirlwind. He had what he needed. He had the truth. But the truth was only as powerful as the man who wielded it. He was a drifter with no standing, and Roy Barlow was the most powerful man in Redemption Gulch. The translated letter alone might not be enough. He needed more. He needed the law, but a law that Barlow couldn't buy. Before leaving the next morning with the precious translation, he sent a telegraph message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Virginia City, detailing the fraud and the suspicious death. He asked for help, knowing it was a long shot. Marshals had entire territories to cover. One drifter's word against a prominent citizen was thin evidence. He rode back even harder, pushing himself and dust to their limits. He arrived on the morning of the third day, just as the sun was cresting the eastern hills. As he approached the edge of town, he saw them. Barlow was there, along with the town marshal and 2 other men. They were standing in front of Mai Lin's shack. She was outside, a small, defiant figure standing beside her meager possessions, which had been piled in the dirt, the cot, the chair, the small table, the wooden box. Jedediah spurred Dust into a gallop. He reined in sharply, sliding to a halt between Barlow and Mai Lin, the horse kicking up a cloud of dust. "You're trespassing, Stone," Barlow snarled, his composure finally cracking. "This is my property." "Is it?" Jedediah swung down from the saddle. He was exhausted and filthy, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He pulled the translated letter from his shirt. "Or is it just another piece of a dead man's life you thought you could steal?" He didn't hand it to Barlow. He held it out to the marshal. "This is a translation of a letter written by Wei, the man who died in the railroad collapse. It's a sworn statement from an apothecary in Carson City. It details how you, Mr. Barlow, stole wages from your entire crew. It seems Wei was about to expose you right before that accidental cave-in." The marshal, a paunchy man named Gable, looked nervously from the paper to Barlow. "Roy, what's he talking about?" "He's a liar," Barlow blustered, his face turning a blotchy red. It's the word of a drifter and some foreigner against mine. It's more than that, Jedediah said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. A small crowd of townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. I also sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal in Virginia City. I imagine he'll be very interested in looking into the railroad's employment records. And Way's death. The mention of a U.S. Marshal changed everything. Marshal Gable's loyalty to Barlow was one thing, obstructing a federal investigation was another entirely. The color drained from Barlow's face. He had built his power on the assumption that no one would ever look too closely, that his victims were too powerless to fight back. He had never counted on a stubborn drifter and the carefully kept words of a dead man. Barlow looked at the faces in the crowd, at the dawning suspicion in their eyes. He looked at Mai Lin, who stood watching him not with hatred, but with a calm, unwavering resolve. His empire of fear was crumbling. Without another word, he turned and stalked away. Marshal Gable, after a moment's hesitation, followed him, leaving his two hired men standing awkwardly behind. Jedediah walked over to Mai Lin. He gently took the eviction notice from the ground and tore it in two. He looked at her belongings, piled in the dust. "Let's get this back inside," he said softly. 6 months later, the shack by the dry creek was transformed. A proper glass window glinted in the afternoon sun, and the sagging roof had been replaced. The small patch of dirt where a few bin plants had struggled was now a thriving garden, its neat rows of vegetables a testament to months of hard work. A sturdy new porch ran the length of the front, and sitting on it, in a second chair that matched the first, was Jedediah Stone. Roy Barlow was gone. The U.S. Marshal had arrived a week after the confrontation, and his investigation had unraveled Barlow's entire enterprise. He was facing federal charges for fraud and was suspected of much worse. The town of Redemption Gulch, stripped of its bully, was slowly finding a new, quieter rhythm. Mai Lin came out of the house, carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed one to Jedediah. Her old, tattered cheongsam was gone, replaced by a simple but well-made dress of blue cotton. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. She had used the settlement money, finally paid in full by the railroad, to buy the deed to the land and make the house a true home. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its slow descent. Jedediah was no longer a drifter. He had found work at the livery, his skill with horses earning him a steady wage and the respect of the townsfolk who had once shunned him. He had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a place to belong. "The bin blossoms are coming in again," she said, looking at the garden. He smiled, remembering the first one she had given him, a silent message of thanks. Theirs was not a love of grand declarations or passionate speeches. It was built slowly, piece by piece, like the new roof on the house. It was built on shared work, quiet understanding, and the day he saw a woman with 5 pennies and decided that wasn't how her story should end. On the small table inside, a fresh loaf of bread, baked that morning in her own small oven, was cooling. It was more than enough. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.